the official prequel novel to the highly anticipated film. A long time ago, there was the Great War. The reasons for the war have been lost to time. On the shattered surface of the earth, there is a metropolis that lives amidst the garbage thrown down from the inhabitants of a sky city floating above it. Welcome to Iron City. A lonely doctor specializing in cyborg repair, Ido, is doing his best to help the citizens of Iron City, but Ido has a double life, another persona born from the pieces of his broken heart. Hugo, a young man surviving on a life of crime, spots the ultimate steal, an object that will unearth secrets from his own past. And Vector, the most powerful businessman in the city, has his sights set on a new technology that will change the future of Iron City forever. Hello everyone, and welcome to a book review that is also a different book to Star Wars Expanded Universe as I normally do. This time I'm going to be talking about the Iron City prequel to Alita Battle Angel. Yeah, the cover's a little bit confusing because it's really titled Iron City, I think. But it really connects into and is a lead into the movie of Alita Battle Angel, which I love. I really enjoyed the movie, and then I read all of the manga, and I did a review of the first series of the manga, but I feel like, honestly, I didn't give it enough justice because I didn't take notes through it. So what I thought I would do as well, during my break I have now, reading other novels, is take some notes, see how it goes, and for this one, there is plenty to talk about. So, this is written by Pat Cadigan, and also the main movie novelist, but that will come later, and is a prequel to the Alita Battle Angel movie. Now, to understand why I say that, is because the movie timeline is a different timeline to the manga version of the story. They vary quite a bit, as I will talk a little bit more about later. It was released in 2018 though, this one, so it was actually before the movie came out. So that may have been a different perspective if I had read it before the movie to actually understand everything that goes on. Talk about that a bit as I go a little bit as well, but overall I did enjoy this, but I don't know if you'll enjoy it if you're not a huge fan of the movie, because it really does just give a lot of background to the movie rather than actually adding its own story in as much. The main bits of why I enjoyed it was because it fleshed out more about the different way this is for the world in the movie version of Alita compared to the manga, and half of it seems like flashbacks. Well, it seems like half of it's flashbacks at least, which doesn't seem as good as if we'd followed maybe Ido along when he was already up in Salem and then getting dropped and going through, that sort of thing. Whereas it gives some of that background in flashbacks here. It would have been nice to have more, like, go a bit further back, have a bit of a story about what's happened a bit more with some more detail and all of that. However, this is what they choose to tell for the prequel into the movie. And I don't have too much more to say for that, other than I think if you weren't super keen on the movie, like you thought it was a good movie, but you're not super into the world, I don't know if this will really be a cup of tea, per se, because I am really interested in the manga world, which is what I've been reading more of now than the movie, and that's what's held my interest more than it holding its interest on its own a bit more. But there are some interesting bits in it though. So what I normally do in my reviews, if you're just joining, is I take notes as I read it. That was what I think is spoiler free a bit, and then I'm going to go into the details as I took my notes as I read it. So, the prologue is interesting. It's giving a history to the state of the world. Some of the details I noticed straight off the bat were a modern twist on Yukito Kishiro's original ideas in the original manga, putting in place things in the movie, while at the same time having me thinking of that it could fit relatively well together in some ways. It has the same core to it, but it's a different interpretation of how the history went. And so, also, I forgot to mention earlier, was that some things seem like they would limit the potential of a sequel, at least to be as close as possible to the manga. And this sort of becomes more evident throughout the story. But yeah, the prologue has the same sort of core when it's given the background to it, and of course a very brief background. History is lost in the manga, so it's very much could be that that's the interpretation at the time. Anyway, it does open up on a woman, Sarata, being treated in a clinic by a pale man. Which you go, why did you bother to call him a pale man? Why didn't you just call him Ito from the get-go? Like, I get he's a bit paler, all that stuff here, but I mean, having watched the movie, read the manga, it's obviously Ito. I don't know why they didn't just say Ito, but I guess they wanted to keep some of the mystery. If this is your first book in the Alita Battle Angel universe, you haven't read the manga or anything, who is this pale man? It just seems like this is the first time I've read it, and it seemed like, why didn't you just say Ito? Anyway, it's interesting how he's working on a chip for integration between old and new cyborg parts. This is something that's unique to this story, and I think that's a really interesting twist on it, and a really interesting idea that they put in, because Ito's being able to create new technology, even down in Iron City, in this case, the scrapyard, Iron City, and be able to do this. And Hugo was there helping him out a bit as an assistant for, well, at least a little bit, at his clinic when he was 17, which is different from the manga, whereas Hugo comes in and does some repairs on the cellar and whatnot. And also, I didn't get the impression that Hugo had been an assistant to Ito earlier on in the movie, so it's quite interesting that they added this in. And it's also interesting how it's adding into Hugo learning a bit under Ito, even if he doesn't understand it all, and Hugo being a cut above other kids by, well, at least Ito, thinking he's looking to learn things that they don't teach in Iron City. And I think, in some way, if he actually wanted to, he could have. And it would be an interesting potential there if he actually would have. What's also interesting is how it goes into what happened in Salem. Back with Ito and Shirin and their daughter, Alita. And it says that their daughter had a birth defect from birth, how she was frail and weak, and they had to leave the perfect society. Which is a marked difference from the manga. Namely, how they go into Nova being in charge. They do not have a mention of Melchizedek because of all of that. And there's no Agamabadi in charge of Salem or Tifaris and all that either. They were told to get out by errand boys in suits, which gives me the impression of something a bit different to the sort of clothing they wore when at least Alita went up in Alita Battle Angel Last Order. And it's quite different, the impression I get from reading this novel of what Salem is like compared to Tifaris or Salem in the manga, which is interesting. It's nice how it gives that they were evicted and they landed in a pod amongst the rubbish to protect them, and there's a bit of an assumption at the end you can make without outright saying it on page 28, which is nice. Like, they don't say everything straight out, and I like the kind of writing that Pat does in this, that she doesn't say everything straight out, although I think she was doing it on purpose here to leave more of a mystery. Oh yeah, it suddenly understood why Shirin had bolted. She had been terrified of seeing something she recognised. He tossed the bowl away. Like, because they land in the scrap and all that. Which is an interesting addition as well, because it also parallels Alita landing in the scrap later. And they had him waking up, so he was flashing back as he was dreaming, then being woken up by Hugo in an emergency. That's a nice change in how it's written when we change to Hugo's perspective, because it actually feels like we're in Hugo's mind compared to Ido, who thinks differently to Hugo, which is good. And it shows Hugo's true intentions and how he actually thinks a bit more, which gives a bit of a broader understanding and very much a thing of Ido thought something and he's thinking something completely different, which is actually pretty cool. The personal code mentality for Iron City is something that wasn't really explored in the manga, I don't think. It's not really said about, but also it's very much a thing of Hugo's own personal beliefs that he should have a personal code, and he wouldn't really talk out loud about it, which you would need to be able to go into it in the manga. So it's nice to go into his thought process here in the novel. But it's also an interesting backstory to Hugo it gives. It does sound like a good family, where some family members are, as I remember, in the OVA, because I watched the anime OVA, and I like how this novel expands on his thought process and not thinking of cyborgs as on the same level as flesh and blood humans. Actually, as a kid he's scared of cyborgs, and then later on he hates them a bit, which is different to that. He also has his brother and stuff there, which also parallels with the OVA, and I think it's in the manga too, but I may be having a brain fart, because I remember the bits and sort of feel in there's different parts of the stories from each, and that's how my brain goes. It's nice that they did include the part where Hugo's brother made a flying machine. A bit different flying machine, but it's also from Hugo's memory each time, so it could vary a little bit. A flying machine is a flying machine a little bit. There's also an interesting expansion on some areas of Iron City, with someone owning territory everywhere. Like, everywhere in Iron City, someone owns the territory. So you've got to be careful not to wander into the territory and get beat up and whatnot. And him nicking the bracelet and stealing the bracelet that reminded him of his mother, which is an interesting... he's a kid, so he would do that to Yas and make some mistakes. And it introduces Vector, and Vector is talking to Gamut, an informer. It does have a funny part on page 61, which is quite interesting, where there are no spaces in the dialogue, between the words in the dialogue, when Vector is speaking. And it does have the intended effect, I guess, is you read it a lot faster than you would if it was normally spoken. Vector cuts a great imposing underworld dealer image throughout this encounter and sets himself, I don't know, differently a bit to just watching the movie. Because you also get some of his thought process and how he acts with other people, which is cool. Gamut mentions churros as they finish up the conversation. So there's an addition to the movie Elitaverse that there are churros as well as chocolate and oranges. And it also has they call the people that work on the multiple players, they're paladins, and the people that work on them are called tuners. And so it says he got a new tuner in Shiren. So this gives us a bit of a time frame of going, this is just after Shiren and Ido broke up, which is actually a nice place to start in some ways, because it allows it to go through all of the motions of Ido's got to get past the breakup and different things are happening inside Iron City. And I guess you don't want to go too far from the movie, because who knows what the actual history was like in this verse. In the description of it, it mentions about building champions bigger and better than Gruishka. And what I didn't know actually was that Gruishka was a former Motorball player. And I don't remember, maybe it's a detail I missed in the movie, I might have to watch the movie again, but I don't remember that being in the movie either, that I mentioned about it being a former Motorball player. Going into Vector's train of thought is cool, seeing from his perspective. It offers a really good contrast to how people are perceiving him and what people think on their end. I love how we go into different characters' perspectives in this book. As Vector dresses down Hugo about being beat up and not being on time with delivery, I'm not sure if Vector would say ass on page 70. Because he seems a bit more refined than that in most places. He also tries to emulate, it says in this book, it's really good insight, he tries to emulate what he thinks as people in Zalem would sound like. I don't know if he would say ass, or ass, however you want to pronounce it, A-S-S, because I thought he would think himself above that sort of speech and talk less roughly, although it might have been him in the heat of the moment a little bit as well. There is more of Edo thinking about Zalem, and it seems that the Zalem people apply for enhancements there, which is cyborg or mechanical parts, and Nova has to approve it, which is quite different to the manga again, because they didn't even really have that thing in the manga. And they all seem more natural in the manga and in the Secret of Tifares, or Secret of Zalem as it would be. Then if you don't know it, you don't know it. And Nova is in charge of the city during the war, it says as well, which is different compared to the manga, as Nova is less of an active participant in things like that in the manga, versus he's in charge of the city. So, yeah, interesting. It's also cool to read how Sharon put so much effort into their daughter's body. How she's the one that made the etchings and the carvings on the body, compared to Edo, who probably did most of the actual mechanical work for it. And as I read about their daughter, it reminds me how physically frail Chaos is in the manga, Nova's son, if you don't know him. And at least when you first meet the character, he's quite frail. So that is also a parallel, I would say, to Alita, their daughter. The more background on the cyborg that broken and killed their daughter is good to have, because he's a washed out motorball player and he was on the drugs and all that. Really cool. And it was saying that that's what stopped Edo from doing motorball cyborgs and just focus solely on his clinic, and of course the other side of that. It switches to Sharon, I think is how they pronounce it in the movie, point of view, which is really interesting to read. She blames Edo for everything, not realizing her own faults, and down to apparently Edo made the pod that they shot out of Zalem, which is an interesting detail. And I wonder if she's actually making things up, or if it's true, because I have had personal experience with it being, some people can make things up if they're blaming someone else and they do not want to blame themselves for things. Also thinking of how Edo never tried to get them to stay in Zalem in some shape or form. I note that he seemed to immediately want to start the clinic in this version, rather than having to learn cyber surgery versus normal biology, and then overcoming more personal issues, as in the manga, before he started his clinic. Quite interesting to me how there's some differences there. And I never noticed in the movie that one of the crew is meant to be Koyomi, which in this version is the same age as Hugo and looks different, which is a definite departure from the character in the manga. So it's more like her name is a reference to Koyomi in the manga versus Koyomi in being the same character as in the manga. It's a nice addition that Tanji has taught Hugo some fighting moves, so they definitely expand upon the friendship between all of the crew that he has with Tanji and Koyomi and all of that. And there's an interesting quote on page 95. The strong don't just prey on the weak, they made sure no one knew their own strength too. And it has some quite interesting philosophy that will go along with that, but I'll just leave the quote there. And what's interesting is that it goes into Vector skimming a lot of the factory shipments. And so Vector set up a fancy dinner with Sharon, and it's interesting how she relates all of the stuff, because we see from her point of view how she relates it all to Zalem and is surprised and all of the things from that. And then the outcome of that dinner, that conversation, is very, I guess you could call it, interesting. With her mindset of being mightier than thou, higher than thou, and nothing will be as good as Zalem. In the end, she knows that he's using her, the Vector is using her, and that she is using him. Quite interesting. And it goes into Ito's, and then it ends with that. And I won't say the next bit too much. And then it goes into Ito's night job. Not sure how it would be as a first introduction to it, to be honest. And this is what I feel like with some of the things in this. Because it seems you wouldn't be able to fully grasp the situation of what is actually happening without knowing the later story, that he is a hunter warrior, that he is going and doing that stuff. Because I know I could pick it up, but reading it, I wonder how much I would actually be able to read between the lines to be able to pick up from the descriptions in the book if I didn't know really anything about the universe. And yeah, Vector did have a bit one earlier, but it says again that Ito and Sharon are having phone numbers, and they have phones, and they're calling people and all that, which we don't really see in the movie or the manga, because the manga is very much more cyberpunky a bit, how the technology is more old style, yet there's also advancements like cyborg parts and all of that. Nice that Ito is working on the arm of the musician we see, with the double neck guitar in the movie, so the guy playing the guitar with two necks and all that. That was really cool, and it gives the impression that Motorball is transmitted up to Zalem, which is another difference from the manga, because very rarely, at least when Alita got up to Zalem, did the Motorball ever go up there. Or anything get transmitted downstairs, if it gets transmitted at all. Oh, it's really cool. They have Ito working on the arm for the nurse that we see in the movie too, which is nice to see. He created the arm for her and all that. It mentions the Deckman when Ito got his Hunter Warrior license, because it has a bit of a flashback when he went to get it. And it's interesting because you probably wouldn't get a really good description of what they are. And I wonder how your imagination would imagine them separately, because even I would imagine them a bit differently to how I saw them in the movie and the manga. It is interesting as Ito knows about the world before the war, which in this case is as we know it now, sort of thing. Like, they have the modern world sorts of stuff before the war happened, and Ito's educated about that. Like, they get educated about it up in Salem and they know the history, compared to the manga when that didn't happen. And also in the manga, the history was hidden by Melchizedek and all that stuff. The breakdown moment with Ito is quite emotional. It's also great to know his mental state, that he still hasn't gotten over his daughter's death and he still is working through things. And it starts mentioning the cafe. The coffee. Which, I mean, there was one cafe, a side story, anecdote, that I saw called the Coffee Cafe. Cafe just means coffee. So, the coffee, the Coffee Cafe. There's the coffee as well. It just seems like a really silly name. I ended up auto-creating it in my brain as I read it, to just call it the cafe. Because that's what it was. Anyway. Hugo's interactions with his friends is good. They have some fun banter, dialogue, all that good stuff. Apparently they have iced coffee too, so not all commodities are lost. And it is interesting how we see Hugo's group, Jake the Cyborg, with an extended nervous system, which Vector did mention in the conversation with Sharon, and is an interesting advancement. They're still advancing technology down in Iron City compared to Zalem. Soledad is a very interesting introduction that we don't see in the movie, but could appear later. But I'll get to that. A specialist that most noticeably changes her appearance by rearranging her bone facial structure underneath her skin. It's really cool. But it does say it changes a cyborg bone structure in her face rather than the rest of her body. So there may be a little bit of a drawback from that, but also apparently that kind of technology is illegal in Iron City, and the Centurions will kill them if they know about it. Well, you know, they'll put a bounty on them. And it's also funny that where Hugo breaks in, no, Hugo doesn't, Soledad breaks into Ito's lab and mistakes a musician's arms for a sex aid. A little funny joke there. It's interesting to get a view of Ito from someone different, because she watches him and sort of does an assessment of what he's like and all that, and then snuck in to steal the chip. And I was there thinking, the safe alarm will go off, the safe alarm will go off, surely he would know. But no, he put it on silent. The fool. Anyway. Yeah, the little detail actually, because I mentioned that, is in the novel they have a little detail of like, that's when the drugs will be there, and they would, both Sharon and Ito had an alarm that went to their phones to say when the safe was opened, in case someone was stealing and breaking and getting in and stealing it, and also to stop them from being tempted to use the drugs to escape from the world they live in. And I do really like how it gets into it a bit later, how we get a proper encounter of Ito as a hunter warrior and his thought process throughout. This is a part where, if I was reading it for the first time, knew nothing about the universe, I might have to go, hang on, that's what he was doing? Wait, do I have to reread the bit earlier? Maybe. And it's also interesting that Sharon got so desperate that she called Ito to help even after they split, and there are such differences. They name drop a bunch of notable players from the manga, which is cool, and they also ended up being referenced in the movie, which is nice. It's really interesting to read the dynamic between Sharon and Ito in the lab, especially from Ito's perspective, how he sort of still wants to help her, but he knows that she's just going to use him again, that sort of stuff. And the great moment of realization when Ito knows his chip was stolen after talking to Ajikari, which is really interesting because he still has a good relationship with some of the notable players and stuff. Apparently it's also the first time Hugo gets scared jacking a cyborg, so it's a huge cyborg that's difficult to take down. It's interesting, the trainer that was with Chase, who ended up addicted and causing troubles, is Ed, who in the manga, Ed is Alita's trainer for Motorball. Who knows if it will be later on. It's interesting how the chip increases aggression. It's probably the issue of it predicting what it wants to do, which Ito hadn't fixed. But also they reveal a little bit later on than the note I'm reading, it is because of how the chip works with their system that it will cause problems. And I like how it gives more personality to Ajikari, because we don't really see any in the manga or the movie for the other notable players as much, so it's really cool that it gives some more personality to Ajikari. I like that. It's really interesting how Ito is the one to find Chase in an underground fight, because he tails him a bit and everything, and then Ito trying to talk him out of it. It obviously wasn't going to work with the mentality of the dude, and he gets knocked out. And it's nice to see Gerhard, the nurse, looking after Ito. And then she knows, and it's revealed that Ito reveals to her about the hunter warrior business, so that sort of stuff. And she looks after him. And I was thinking after that, Ito goes out again and pops those analgesics like nothing. It's like, I'm munchy, there's analgesics. Then it has a part where he thinks he's overdoing it himself, which is a little reference to what the reader's thinking, which is really nice that Pat predicted that to write in there. It is also interesting that Nova is influencing Ito through someone in Iron City before the movie, because it's a fortune teller that Ito goes to and is popping those analgesics. And she's actually controlled by Nova to lead him to the cathedral to encounter Chase. And Nova speaks to Ito after the cool moment of Ito killing Chase, and he actually speaks to Chase, which is really cool moment to lead into that, but it doesn't seem like there's so much of a payoff yet of Ito talking to the people, like especially to Ito here. And that page 315 misses an end quotation mark in one part of it. Vector angry and drunk is actually interesting to read versus his normally cool and collected self there. It's a nice moment when Hugo gives his mother's bracelet to Koyomi, and I forget if I even noticed she's wearing it in the movie, so I have to watch the movie again and see. And it's cool that Ito was Joshigun's tuner when he worked with Notable Contenders, a reference to the manga when Ito works with Joshigun as he's trying to get Alita back, which is pretty cool. And Chiron reminisces on meeting Ito during medical training up in Zaylan, which is nice another tidbit that they do medical training up in Zaylan. The more you know, right? And Soledad meets Sharon, which is interesting. And Sharon mentions about face morphing being illegal. And it's interesting that whole dynamic between when Soledad's like, you're missing something, you're gone, and she's going, no, wait, what's happening? Yeah. And it's starting to make herself doubt and question about where she's at, which probably leads to more of what happens in the movie. And it's interesting with Gerhard giving Ito the lesson about how not everything needs to be perfect, and that leads into Ito actually breaking the chip and destroying the work he was doing because it wasn't going to work out, and he can't get it perfect. And the ending part is cool, with Ito recovering as we see it lead into the movie of where people are at. It mentions bags of origins as payment for services, which is what Ito has for Alita. And it ends on a nice note, ready to go into the movie story with adding a lot more background to everything. And also at the end it had about the author, and that the author has actually read the manga and watched the OVA and is into anime and manga a bit more as well, rather than just Alita. So that's really cool to have an author write the novel for it that was also into the other parts of it. But I think the main thing for this is still that the characters don't seem far enough removed from where they are in the movie that they make enough progression, it feels to me, because it goes really cool to read the extra background and stuff, but I don't know if it would work very well. Maybe it follows too many people a bit at some point, maybe because it's half flashbacks and stuff. It doesn't feel like a lot happens in the present day of it. Like, sure, Ito doing some of his work, the chip was the main MacGuffin of this, but it didn't feel like as important a story, which obviously it probably isn't as Alita, but there's some things and plot threads and stuff that still haven't been picked up. Also, Hugo's anti-cyborg sentiment is not picked up really at all that we see in the movie. I'm still reading through. The next book I'm reading is the novel of the movie, so I'm going to see if it comes up with that, but so far it hasn't. So it'll be interesting. But anyway, that's how it is. I did enjoy reading it, although, again, I don't know how it would be to someone who doesn't really know the universe, and it may not be your cup of tea even if you thought the movie was good, but you don't really go super into everything. But yeah, I would definitely recommend to read the manga if you like the movie and all of that good stuff. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. You can subscribe for more book reviews. I mainly do Star Wars Expanded Universe content, but of course for now I'm also reviewing other books I'm reading during my Christmas break. And Merry Christmas to you all, Happy New Year, and I'll see you in the next video. Anyway.